Chapter 23 of Ruth. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Cynthia Lyons. Chapter 23 of Ruth by Elizabeth Cleghorn Gaskell. Recognition. Saturday came. Torn, ragged clouds were driven across the sky. It was not a becoming day for the scenery, and the little girls regretted it much. First they hoped for a change at 12 o'clock, and then at the afternoon tide-turning, but at neither time did the sun show his face. "Papa will never buy this dear place," said Elizabeth sadly, as she watched the weather. "The sun is everything to it. The sea looks quite leaden to-day, and there's no sparkle on it. And the sands, that were so yellow and sun-sparkled on Thursday, are all one dull brown now." "Never mind, to-morrow may be better," said Ruth cheerily. "I wonder what time they will come at?" inquired Mary. "Your papa said they would be at the station at 5 o'clock. And the landlady at the Swan said it would take them half an hour to get here." "And are they to dine at 6?" asked Elizabeth. "Yes," answered Ruth, "and I think, if we had our tea half an hour earlier at 4:30, and then went out for a walk, we should be nicely out of the way just during the bustle of the arrival and dinner, and we could be in the drawing-room ready against your papa came in after dinner." "Oh, that would be nice," said they, and tea was ordered accordingly. The south-westerly wind had dropped, and the clouds were stationary, when they went out on the sands. They dug little holes near the incoming tide, and made canals to them from the water, and blew the light sea foam against each other, and then stole on tiptoe near to the groups of grey and white seagulls, which despised their caution, flying softly and slowly away to a little distance as soon as they drew near. And in all this Ruth was as great a child as any. Only she longed for Leonard with a mother's longing, as indeed she did every day, and all hours of the day. By and by the clouds thickened yet more, and 1 or 2 drops of rain were felt. It was very little, but Ruth feared a shower for her delicate Elizabeth, and besides, the September evening was fast closing in the dark and sunless day. As they turned homewards in the rapidly increasing dusk, they saw 3 figures on the sand near the rocks, coming in their direction. "Papa and Mr Donne!" exclaimed Mary. "Now we shall see him." "Which do you make out is him?" asked Elizabeth. "Oh, the tall one, to be sure. Don't you see how papa always turns to him, as if he were speaking to him, and not to the other?" "Who is the other?" asked Elizabeth. "Mr Bradshaw said that Mr Farquhar and Mr Hickson would come with him. But that is not Mr Farquhar, I am sure," said Ruth. The girls looked at each other, as they always did, when Ruth mentioned Mr Farquhar's name, but she was perfectly unconscious both of the look and of the conjectures which gave rise to it. As soon as the 2 parties drew near, Mr Bradshaw called out in his strong voice, "Well, my dears, we found there was an hour before dinner, so we came down upon the sands, and here you are." The tone of his voice assured them that he was in a bland and indulgent mood, and the 2 little girls ran towards him. He kissed them, and shook hands with Ruth, told his companions that these were the little girls who were tempting him to this extravagance of purchasing Eagle's Crag, and then, rather doubtfully, and because he saw that Mr Donne expected it, he introduced "my daughter's governess, Mrs Denbigh." It was growing darker every moment, and it was time they should hasten back to the rocks, which were even now indistinct in the grey haze. Mr Bradshaw held a hand of each of his daughters, and Ruth walked alongside, the 2 strange gentlemen being on the outskirts of the party. Mr. Bradshaw began to give his little girls some home news. He told them that Mr. Farquhar was ill and could not accompany them, but Jemima and their mamma were quite well. The gentleman nearest to Ruth spoke to her. "Are you fond of the sea?" asked he. There was no answer, so he repeated his question in a different form. "Do you enjoy staying by the seaside? I should rather ask." The reply was yes, rather breathed out in a deep inspiration than spoken in a sound. The sands heaved and trembled beneath Ruth. The figures near her vanished into strange nothingness. The sounds of their voices were as distant sounds in a dream, while the echo of one voice thrilled through and through. She could have caught at his arm for support, in the awful dizziness which wrapped her up body and soul. That voice, no, if name and face and figure were all changed, that voice was the same which had touched her girlish heart, which had spoken most tender words of love, which had won and wrecked her, and which she had last heard in the low mutterings of fever. She dared not look round to see the figure of him who spoke, dark as it was. She knew he was there. She heard him speak in the manner in which he used to address strangers years ago. Perhaps she answered him, perhaps she did not, God knew. It seemed as if weights were tied to her feet, as if the steadfast rocks receded, as if time stood still. It was so long, so terrible, that path across the reeling sand. At the foot of the rocks they separated. Mr. Bradshaw, afraid lest dinner should cool, preferred the shorter way for himself and his friends. On Elizabeth's account, the girls were to take the longer and easier path, which wound upwards through a rocky field where larks' nests abounded, and where wild thyme and heather were now throwing out their sweets to the soft night air. The little girls spoke in eager discussion of the strangers. They appealed to Ruth, but Ruth did not answer, and they were too impatient to convince each other to repeat the question. The first little ascent from the sands to the fields surmounted, Ruth sat down suddenly and covered her face with her hands. This was so unusual. Their wishes, their good, was so invariably the rule of motion or of rest in their walks, that the girls, suddenly checked, stood silent and affrighted in surprise. They were still more startled when Ruth wailed aloud some inarticulate words. "Are you not well, dear Mrs Denbigh?" asked Elizabeth gently, kneeling down on the grass by Ruth. She sat facing the west. The low, watery twilight was on her face as she took her hands away. So pale, so haggard, so wild and wandering a look the girls had never seen on human countenance before. "Well, what are you doing here with me? You should not be with me," said she, shaking her head slowly. They looked at each other. "You are sadly tired," said Elizabeth soothingly. "Come home and let me help you to bed. I will tell papa you are ill, and ask him to send for a doctor." Ruth looked at her as if she did not understand the meaning of her words. No more she did at first. But by and by the dulled brain began to think most vividly and rapidly, and she spoke in a sharp way which deceived the girls into a belief that nothing had been the matter. "Yes, I was tired. I am tired. Those sands, oh, those sands, those weary, dreadful sands! But that is all over now. Only my heart aches still. Feel how it flutters and beats," said she, taking Elizabeth's hand, and holding it to her side. "I am quite well, though," she continued, reading pity in the child's looks, as if she felt the trembling, quivering beat. "We will go straight into the dressing-room and read a chapter that will still my heart, and then I'll go to bed, and Mr Bradshaw will excuse me, I know, this one night. I only ask for one night. Put on your right frocks, dears, and do all you ought to do. But I know you will," said she, bending down to kiss Elizabeth, and then, before she had done so, raising her head abruptly, "You are good and dear girls. God keep you so." By a strong effort at self-command, she went onwards at an even pace, neither rushing nor pausing to sob and think. The very regularity of motion calmed her. The front and back doors of the house were on two sides, at right angles with each other. They all shrank a little from the idea of going in at the front door, now that the strange gentlemen were about, and accordingly they went through the quiet farmyard right into the bright ruddy kitchen, where the servants were dashing about with the dinner things. It was a contrast in more than colour to the lonely dusky field, which even the little girls perceived, and the noise, the warmth, the very bustle of the servants were a positive relief to Ruth, and for the time lifted off the heavy press of pent-up passion. A silent house, with moonlit rooms, or with a faint gloom brooding over the apartments, would have been more to be dreaded. Then she must have given way and cried out. As it was, she went up the old awkward back stairs, and into the room they were to sit in. There was no candle. Mary volunteered to go down for one, and when she returned, she was full of the wonders of preparation in the drawing-room, and ready and eager to dress, so as to take her place there before the gentlemen had finished dinner. But she was struck by the strange paleness of Ruth's face, now that the light fell upon it. "Stay up here, dear Mrs. Denbigh. We'll tell papa you are tired and gone to bed." Another time Ruth would have dreaded Mr. Bradshaw's displeasure, for it was an understood thing that no one was to be ill or tired in his household without leave asked, and cause given and assigned. But she never thought of that now. Her great desire was to hold quiet till she was alone. Quietness it was not, it was rigidity. But she succeeded in being rigid in look and movement, and went through her duties to Elizabeth, who preferred remaining with her upstairs, with wooden precision. But her heart felt at times like ice, at times like burning fire, always a heavy, heavy weight within her. At last Elizabeth went to bed. Still Ruth dared not think. Mary would come upstairs soon, and with a strange, sick, shrinking yearning, Ruth awaited her, and the crumbs of intelligence she might drop out about him. Ruth's sense of hearing was quickened to miserable intensity as she stood before the chimney-piece, grasping it tight with both hands, gazing into the dying fire, but seeing not the dead grey embers or the little sparks of vivid light that ran hither and thither among the wood ashes, but an old farmhouse, and climbing, winding road, and a little golden, breezy common, with a rural inn on the hilltop, far, far away. And through the thoughts of the past came the sharp sounds of the present, of three voices, one of which was almost silence, it was so hushed. Indifferent people would only have guessed that Mr. Donne was speaking by the quietness in which the others listened. But Ruth heard the voice and many of the words, though they conveyed no idea to her mind. She was too much stunned even to feel curious to know to what they related. He spoke. That was her one fact. Presently up came Mary, bounding, exultant. Papa had let her stay up 1/4 of an hour longer, because Mr. Hickson had asked. Mr. Hickson was so clever, she did not know what to make of Mr. Donne. He seemed such a dawdle, but he was very handsome. Had Ruth seen him? Oh no, she could not. It was so dark on those stupid sands. Well, never mind, she would see him to-morrow. She must be well to-morrow. Papa seemed a good deal put out that neither she nor Elizabeth were in the drawing-room to-night, and his last words were, "Tell Mrs. Denbigh, I hope," and papa's hopes always meant expect. She will be able to make breakfast at 9 o'clock. And then she would see Mr. Dunn. That was all Ruth heard about him. She went with Mary into her bedroom, helped her to undress, and put the candle out. At length she was alone in her own room. At length. But the tension did not give way immediately. She fastened her door, and threw open the window, cold and threatening as was the night. She tore off her gown. She put her hair back from her heated face. It seemed now as if she could not think, as if thought and emotion had been repressed so sternly that they would not come to relieve her stupefied brain, till all at once, like a flash of lightning, her life, past and present, was revealed to her to its minutest detail. And when she saw her very present now, the strange confusion of agony was too great to be borne, and she cried aloud. Then she was quite dead, and listened as to the sound of galloping armies. If I might see him! If I might see him! If I might just ask him why he left me! If I had vexed him in any way! It was so strange, so cruel! It was not him, it was his mother, said she, almost fiercely, as if answering herself. O God! But he might have found me out before this, she continued sadly. He did not care for me as I did for him. He did not care for me at all, she went on wildly and sharply. He did me cruel harm. I can never lift up my face in innocence. They think I have forgotten all, because I do not speak. Oh, darling love, am I talking against you? Asked she tenderly. I am so torn and perplexed. You, who are the father of my child. But that very circumstance, full of such tender meaning in many cases, threw a new light into her mind. It changed her from the woman into the mother, the stern guardian of her child. She was still for a time, thinking. Then she began again, but in a low, deep voice. He left me. He might have been hurried off, but he might have inquired. He might have learned and explained. He left me to bear the burden and the shame, and never cared to learn, as he might have done, of Leonard's birth. He has no love for his child, and I will have no love for him. She raised her voice while uttering this determination, and then, feeling her own weakness, she moaned out, "Alas, alas!" And then she started up. For all this time she had been rocking herself backwards and forwards as she sat on the ground, and began to pace the room with hurried steps. What am I thinking of? Where am I? I who have been praying these years and years to be worthy to be Leonard's mother. My God, what a depth of sin is in my heart! Why, the old time would be as white as snow to what it would be now, if I sought him out, and prayed for the explanation, which would re-establish him in my heart. I who have striven, or made a mock of trying, to learn God's holy will in order to bring up Leonard into the full strength of a Christian. I who have taught his sweet, innocent lips to pray, "Lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil." And yet, somehow, I've been longing to give him to his father, who is. She almost choked, till at last she cried sharp out, "Oh, my God, I do believe Leonard's father is a bad man, and yet, oh, pitiful God, I love him. I cannot forget. I cannot." She threw her body half out the window into the cold night air. The wind was rising, and came in great gusts. The rain beat down on her. It did her good. A still, calm night would not have soothed her as this did. The wild, tattered clouds, hurrying past the moon, gave her a foolish kind of pleasure that almost made her smile a vacant smile. The blast-driven rain came on her again, and drenched her hair through and through. The words, "stormy wind fulfilling his word," came into her mind. She sat down on the floor. This time her hands were clasped round her knees. The uneasy rocking motion was stilled. "I wonder if my darling is frightened with this blustering, noisy wind. I wonder if he is awake." And then her thoughts went back to the various times of old, when, affrighted by the weather, sounds so mysterious in the night, he had crept into her bed and clung to her, and she had soothed him, and sweetly awed him into stillness and childlike faith, by telling him of the goodness and power of God. Of a sudden she crept to a chair, and there knelt as in the very presence of God, hiding her face, at first not speaking a word, for he did not know her heart, but by and by moaning out, amid her sobs and tears, and now for the first time she wept. "O my God, help me, for I am very weak. My God, I pray thee be my rock and my strong fortress, for I of myself am nothing. If I ask in his name, thou wilt give it me. In the name of Jesus Christ, I pray for strength to do thy will." She could not think, or indeed remember, anything but that she was weak and God was strong, and a very present help in time of trouble. And the wind rose yet higher, and the house shook and vibrated, as, in measured time, the great and terrible gusts came from the four quarters of the heavens and blew around it, dying away in the distance with loud and unearthly wails, which were not utterly still before the sound of the coming blast was heard like the trumpets of the vanguard of the Prince of Air. There was a knock at the bedroom door, a little gentle knock, and a soft child's voice. "Mrs. Denbigh, may I come in, please? I am so frightened." It was Elizabeth. Ruth calmed her passionate breathing by one hasty draught of water, and opened the door to the timid girl. "Oh, Mrs. Denbigh, did you ever hear such a night? I am so frightened, and I and Mary sleep so sound." Ruth was too much shaken to be able to speak all at once, but she took Elizabeth in her arms to reassure her. Elizabeth stood back. "Why, how wet you are, Mrs. Denbigh! And there's the window open, I do believe. Oh, how cold it is!" said she, shivering. "Get into my bed, dear," said Ruth. "But do come too. The candle gives such a strange light with that long wick, and somehow your face does not look like you. Please put the candle out and come to bed. I am so frightened, and it seems as if I should be safer if you were by me." Ruth shut the window and went to bed. Elizabeth was all shivering and quaking. To soothe her, Ruth made a great effort, and spoke of Leonard and his fears, and, in a low hesitating voice, she spoke of God's tender mercy, but very humbly, for she feared lest Elizabeth should think her better and holier than she was. The little girl was soon asleep, her fears forgotten, and Ruth, worn out by passionate emotion, and obliged to be still for fear of awakening her bedfellow, went off into a short slumber, through the depths of which the echoes of her waking sobs quivered up. When she awoke, the grey light of autumnal dawn was in the room. Elizabeth slept on, but Ruth heard the servants about, and the early farmyard sounds. After she had recovered from the shock of consciousness and recollection, she collected her thoughts with a stern calmness. He was here. In a few hours she must meet him. There was no escape, except through subterfuges and contrivances that were both false and cowardly. How it would all turn out she could not say, or even guess. But of one thing she was clear, and to one thing she would hold fast. That was, that, come what might, she would obey God's law, and, be the end of all what it might, she would say, "Thy will be done." She only asked for strength enough to do this when the time came. How the time would come, what speech or action would be requisite on her part, she did not know. She did not even try to conjecture. She left that in his hands. She was icy cold but very calm when the breakfast bell rang. She went down immediately, because she felt that there was less chance of a recognition if she were already at her place behind the tea urn and busied with the cups, than if she came in after all were settled. Her heart seemed to stand still, but she felt almost a strange exultant sense of power over herself. She felt, rather than saw, that he was not there. Mr Bradshaw and Mr Hickson were, and so busy talking election politics that they did not interrupt their conversation even when they bowed to her. Her pupils sat on one side of her. Before they were quite settled, and while the other two gentlemen yet hung over the fire, Mr Donne came in. Ruth felt as if that moment was like death. She had a kind of desire to make some sharp sound, to relieve a choking sensation, but it was over in an instant, and she sat on very composed and silent, to all outward appearance the very model of a governess who knew her place, and by she felt strangely at ease in her sense of power. She could even listen to what was being said. She had never dared as yet to look at Mr Donne, though her heart burned to see him once again. He sounded changed. The voice had lost its fresh and youthful eagerness of tone, though in peculiarity of modulation it was the same. It could never be mistaken for the voice of another person. There was a good deal said at that breakfast, for none seemed inclined to hurry, although it was Sunday morning. Ruth was compelled to sit there, and it was good for her that she did. That half hour seemed to separate the present Mr Donne very effectively from her imagination of what Mr Bellingham had been. She was no analyzer. She hardly ever had learnt to notice character, but she felt there was some strange difference between the people she had lived with lately and the man who now leant back in his chair, listening in a careless manner to the conversation, but never joining in or expressing any interest in it, unless it somewhere or somehow touched himself. Now, Mr Bradshaw always threw himself into a subject. It might be in a pompous, dogmatic sort of way, but he did do it, whether it related to himself or not, and it was part of Mr Hickson's trade to assume an interest if he felt it not, but Mr Donne did neither the one nor the other. When the other two were talking of many of the topics of the day, he put his glass in his eye, the better to examine into the exact nature of a cold game pie at the other side of the table. Suddenly Ruth felt that his attention was caught by her. Until now, seeing his short-sightedness, she had believed herself safe. Now her face flushed with a painful, miserable blush. But in an instant she was strong and quiet. She looked up straight at his face, and, as if this action took him aback, he dropped his glass and began eating away with great diligence. She had seen him. He was changed, she knew not how. In fact, the expression, which had been only occasional formerly, when his worst self predominated, had become permanent. He looked restless and dissatisfied, but he was very handsome still, and her quick eye had recognised, with a sort of strange pride, that the eyes and mouth were like Leonard's. Although perplexed by the straightforward, brave look she had sent right at him, he was not entirely baffled. He thought this Mrs Denbigh was certainly like poor Ruth, but this woman was far handsomer. Her face was positively Greek, and then such a proud, superb turn of her head, quite queenly. A governess in Mr Bradshaw's family! Why, she might be a Percy or a Howard for the grandeur of her grace. Poor Ruth! This woman's hair was darker, though, and she had less colour, although a more refined-looking person. Poor Ruth! And for the first time for several years he wondered what had become of her, though, of course, there was but one thing that could have happened, and perhaps it was as well he did not know her end, for most likely it would have made him very uncomfortable. He leaned back in his chair, and unobserved, for he would not have thought it gentlemanly to look so fixedly at her if she or any one noticed him, he put up his glass again. She was speaking to one of her pupils, and she did not see him. By Jove, it must be she, though. There were little dimples came out about the mouth as she spoke, just like those he used to admire so much in Ruth, and which he had never seen in any one else, the sunshine without the positive movement of a smile. The longer he looked, the more he was convinced, and it was with a jerk that he recovered himself enough to answer Mr. Bradshaw's question, whether he wished to go to church or not. Church? How far? A mile? No, I think I shall perform my devotions at home to-day. He absolutely felt jealous when Mr. Hickson sprang up to open the door as Ruth and her pupils left the room. He was pleased to feel jealous again. He had been really afraid he was too much used up for such sensations. But Hickson must keep his place. What he was paid for was doing the talking to the electors, not paying attention to the ladies and their families. Mr. Donne had noticed that Mr. Hickson had tried to be gallant to Miss Bradshaw. Let him, if he liked, but let him beware how he behaved to this fair creature, Ruth or no Ruth. It certainly was Ruth. Only how the devil had she played her cards so well as to be the governess, the respected governess, in such a family as Mr. Bradshaw's? Mr. Donne's movements were evidently to be the guide of Mr. Hickson's. Mr. Bradshaw always disliked going to church, partly from principle, partly because he never could find the places in the prayer book. Mr. Donne was in the drawing-room as Mary came down, ready equipped. He was turning over the leaves of the large and handsome Bible. Seeing Mary, he was struck with a new idea. "How singular it is," said he, "that the name of Ruth is so seldom chosen by those good people who go to the Bible before they christen their children. It is a very pretty name, I think." Mr. Bradshaw looked up. "Why, Mary," said he, "is not that Mrs. Denbigh's name?" "Yes, papa," replied Mary eagerly, "and I know two other Ruths. There's Ruth Brown here, and Ruth Macartney at Eccleston." "And I have an aunt called Ruth, Mr. Donne. I don't think your observation holds good. Besides my daughter's governess, I know 3 other Ruths." "Oh, I have no doubt I was wrong. It was just a speech of which one perceives the folly the moment it is made." But secretly he rejoiced with a fierce joy over the success of his device. Elizabeth came to summon Mary. Ruth was glad when she got into the open air and away from the house. 2 hours were gone and over. 2 out of a day and a half, for it might be late on Monday morning before the Eccleston party returned. She felt weak and trembling in body, but strong in power over herself. They had left the house in good time for church, so they needed not to hurry, and they went leisurely along the road, now and then passing some country person whom they knew, and with whom they exchanged a kindly, placid greeting. But presently, to Ruth's dismay, she heard a step behind, coming at a rapid pace, a peculiar clank of rather high-heeled boots, which gave a springy sound to the walk that she had known well long ago. It was like a nightmare, where the evil dreaded is never avoided, never completely shunned, but is by one's side at the very moment of triumph in escape. There he was by her side, and there was still a quarter of a mile intervening between her and the church, but even yet she trusted that he had not recognised her. "I have changed my mind, you see," said he quietly. I have some curiosity to see the architecture of the church. Some of these old country churches have singular bits about them. Mr. Bradshaw kindly directed me part of the way, but I was so much puzzled by turns to the right and turns to the left that I was quite glad to espy your party." That speech required no positive answer of any kind, and no answer did it receive. He had not expected a reply. He knew, if she were Ruth, she could not answer any indifferent words of his, and her silence made him more certain of her identity with the lady by his side. "The scenery here is of a kind new to me, neither grand, wild, nor yet marked by high cultivation, and yet it has great charms. It reminds me of some part of Wales." He breathed deeply, and then added, "You have been in Wales, I believe?" He spoke low, almost in a whisper. The little church bell began to call the lagging people with its quick, sharp summons. Ruth writhed in body and spirit, but struggled on. The church door would be gained at last, and in that holy place she would find peace. He repeated in a louder tone, so as to compel an answer in order to conceal her agitation from the girls. "Have you never been in Wales?" He used never instead of ever, and laid the emphasis on that word, in order to mark his meaning to Ruth and Ruth only. But he drove her to bay. "I have been in Wales, sir," she replied, in a calm, grave tone. "I was there many years ago. Events took place there which contributed to make the recollections of that time most miserable to me. I shall be obliged to you, sir, if you will make no further reference to it." The little girls wondered how Mrs. Denbigh could speak in such a high tone of quiet authority to Mr. Donne, who was almost a member of Parliament, but they settled that her husband must have died in Wales, and of course that would make the recollection of the country most miserable, as she said. Mr. Donne did not dislike the answer, and he positively admired the dignity with which she spoke. His leaving her as he did must have made her very miserable, and he liked the pride that made her retain her indignation until he could speak to her in private, and explain away a good deal of what she might complain of with some justice. The church was reached. They all went up the middle aisle into the Eagle's Crag pew. He followed them in, entered himself, and shut the door. Ruth's heart sank as she saw him there, just opposite to her, coming between her and the clergyman who was to read out the word of God. It was merciless, it was cruel to haunt her there. She durst not lift her eyes to the bright eastern light. She could not see peacefully the marble images of the dead lay on their tombs, for he was between her and all light and peace. She knew that his look was on her, that he never turned his glance away. She could not join in the prayer for the remission of sins while he was there, for his very presence seemed as a sign that their stain would never be washed out of her life. But although goaded and chafed by her thoughts and recollections, she kept very still. No sign of emotion, no flush of colour was on her face as he looked at her. Elizabeth could not find her place, and then Ruth breathed once, long and deeply, as she moved up the pew and out of the straight, burning glance of those eyes of evil meaning. When they sat down for the reading of the first lesson, Ruth turned the corner of the seat so as no longer to be opposite to him. She could not listen. The words seemed to be uttered in some world far away, from which she was exiled and cast out. Their sound, yet more their meaning, was dim and distant. But in this extreme tension of mind, to hold in her bewildered agony, it so happened that one of her senses was preternaturally acute. While all the church and the people swam in misty haze, One point in a dark corner grew clearer and clearer, till she saw, what at another time she could not have discerned at all, a face, a gargoyle I think they call it, at the end of the arch next to the narrowing of the nave into the chancel, and in the shadow of that contraction. The face was beautiful in feature, the next to it was a grinning monkey, but it was not the features that were the most striking part. There was a half-open mouth, not in any way distorted out of its exquisite beauty by the intense expression of suffering it conveyed. Any distortion of the face by mental agony implies that a struggle with circumstance is going on. But in this face, if such a struggle had been, it was over now. Circumstance had conquered, and there was no hope from mortal endeavour, or help from mortal creature to be had. But the eyes looked onward and upward to the hills from whence cometh our help, and though the parted lips seemed ready to quiver with agony, yet the expression of the whole face, owing to these strange, stony, and yet spiritual eyes, was high and consoling. If mortal gaze had never sought its meaning before, in the deep shadow where it had been placed long centuries ago, yet Ruth's did now. Who could have imagined such a look? Who could have witnessed, perhaps felt, such infinite sorrow, and yet dared to lift it up by faith into a peace so pure? Or was it a mere conception? If so, what a soul the unknown carver must have had, for creator and handicraftsman must have been one. No two minds could have been in such perfect harmony. Whatever it was, however it came there, imaginer, carver, sufferer, all were long passed away. Human art was ended, human life done, human suffering over. But this remained. It stilled Ruth's beating heart to look on it. She grew still enough to hear words which have come to many in their time of need, and awed them in the presence of the extremest suffering that the hushed world had ever heard of. The second lesson for the morning of the 25th of September is the 26th chapter of St. Matthew's Gospel. And when they prayed again, Ruth's tongue was unloosed, and she also could pray in his name who underwent the agony in the garden. As they came out of church, there was a little pause and gathering at the door. It had begun to rain. Those who had umbrellas were putting them up. Those who had not were regretting and wondering how long it would last. Standing for a moment, impeded by the people who were thus collected under the porch, Ruth heard a voice close to her say, very low but very distinctly, "I have much to say to you, much to explain. I entreat you to give me the opportunity." Ruth did not reply. She would not acknowledge that she heard, but she trembled nevertheless, for the well-remembered voice was low and soft, and had yet its power to thrill. She earnestly desired to know why and how he had left her. It appeared to her as if that knowledge could alone give her a relief from the restless wondering that had distracted her mind, and that one explanation could do no harm. "No," the higher spirit made answer, "it must not be." Ruth and the girls had each an umbrella. She turned to Mary and said, "Mary, give your umbrella to Mr Donne, and come under mine." Her way of speaking was short and decided. She was compressing her meaning into as few words as possible. The little girl obeyed in silence. As they went first through the churchyard stile, Mr Donne spoke again. "You are unforgiving," said he. "I only ask you to hear me. I have a right to be heard, Ruth. I won't believe you are so much changed as not to listen to me when I entreat." He spoke in a tone of soft complaint, but he himself had done much to destroy the illusion which had hung about his memory for years whenever Ruth had allowed herself to think of it. Besides which, during the time of her residence in the Benson family, her feeling of what people ought to be had been unconsciously raised and refined, and Mr Donne, even while she had to struggle against the force of past recollections, repelled her so much by what he was at present, that every speech of his, every minute they were together, served to make her path more and more easy to follow. His voice retained something of its former influence. When he spoke, without her seeing him, she could not help remembering former days. She did not answer this last speech any more than the first. She saw clearly that, putting aside all thought as to the character of their former relationship, it had been dissolved by his will, his act and deed, and that, therefore, the power to refuse any further intercourse whatsoever remained with her. It sometimes seems a little strange how, after having earnestly prayed to be delivered from temptation, and having given ourselves with shut eyes into God's hand, from that time every thought, every outward influence, every acknowledged law of life, seems to lead us on from strength to strength. It seems strange sometimes, because we notice the coincidence, but it is the natural, unavoidable consequence of all, truth and goodness being one and the same, and therefore carried out in every circumstance, external and internal, of God's creation. When Mr Donne saw that Ruth would not answer him, he became only the more determined that she should hear what he had to say. What that was, he did not exactly know. The whole affair was most mysterious and piquant. The umbrella protected Ruth from more than the rain on that walk homewards, for under its shelter she could not be spoken to unheard. She had not rightly understood at what time she and the girls were to dine. From the gathering at mealtimes she must not shrink, she must show no sign of weakness. But oh, the relief, after that walk, to sit in her own room, locked up, so that neither Mary nor Elizabeth could come by surprise, and to let her weary frame, weary with being so long braced up to rigidity and stiff quiet, fall into a chair anyhow, all helpless, nerveless, motionless, as if the very bones had melted out of her. The peaceful rest which her mind took was in thinking of Leonard. She dared not look before or behind, but she could see him well at present. She brooded over the thought of him, till she dreaded his father more and more. By the light of her child's purity and innocence, she saw evil clearly, and yet more clearly. She thought that, if Leonard ever came to know the nature of his birth, she had nothing for it but to die out of his sight. He could never know, human heart could never know, her ignorant innocence, and all the small circumstances which had impelled her onwards. But God knew, and if Leonard heard of his mother's error, why, nothing remained but death, for she felt then as if she had it in her power to die innocently out of such future agony. But that escape is not so easy. Suddenly a fresh thought came, and she prayed that, through whatever suffering she might be purified, whatever trials, woes, measureless pangs God might see fit to chastise her with, she would not shrink, if only at last she might come into his presence in heaven. Alas! the shrinking from suffering we cannot help. That part of her prayer was vain, and as for the rest, was not the sure justice of his law finding out even now? His laws once broken, his justice and the very nature of those laws bring the immutable retribution. But if we turn penitently to him, he enables us to bear our punishment with a meek and docile heart, for his mercy endureth for ever. Mr Bradshaw had felt himself rather wanting in proper attention to his guest, inasmuch as he had been unable, all in a minute, to comprehend Mr Donne's rapid change of purpose, and before it had entered into his mind that, notwithstanding the distance of the church Mr Donne was going thither, that gentleman was out of the sight, and far out of the reach, of his burly host. But though the latter had so far neglected the duties of hospitality as to allow his visitor to sit in the Eagle's Crag pew, with no other guard of honour than the children and the governess, Mr Bradshaw determined to make up for it by extra attention during the remainder of the day. Accordingly, he never left Mr Donne. Whatever wish that gentleman expressed, it was the study of his host to gratify. Did he hint at the pleasure which a walk in such beautiful scenery would give him, Mr Bradshaw was willing to accompany him, although at Eccleston it was a principle with him not to take any walks for pleasure on a Sunday. When Mr Donne turned round and recollected letters which must be written, and which would compel him to stay at home, Mr Bradshaw instantly gave up the walk, and remained at hand, ready to furnish him with any writing materials which could be wanted, and which were not laid out in the half-furnished house. Nobody knew where Mr Hickson was all this time. He had sauntered out after Mr Donne, when the latter set off for church, and he had never returned. Mr Donne kept wondering if he could have met Ruth, if, in fact, she had gone out with her pupils, now that the afternoon had cleared up. This uneasy wonder, and a few mental imprecations on his host's polite attention, together with a letter-writing pretence, passed away the afternoon, the longest afternoon he had ever spent, and of weariness he had had his share. Lunch was lingering in the dining-room, left there for the truant Mr Hickson, but of the children or Ruth there was no sign. He ventured on a distant inquiry as to their whereabouts. "They dine early. They are gone to church again. Mrs Denbigh was a member of the establishment once, and though she attends chapel at home, she seems glad to have an opportunity of going to church." Mr Donne was on the point of asking some further questions about Mrs Denbigh, when Mr Hickson came in, loud-spoken, cheerful, hungry, and as ready to talk about his ramble, and the way in which he had lost and found himself, as he was about everything else. He knew how to dress up the commonest occurrence with a little exaggeration, a few puns, and a happy quotation or two, so as to make it sound very agreeable. He could read faces, and saw that he had been missed. Both host and visitor looked moped to death. He determined to devote himself to their amusement during the remainder of the day, for he had really lost himself, and felt that he had been away too long on a dull Sunday, when people were apt to get hipped if not well amused. "It is really a shame to be indoors in such a place. Rain? Yes, it rained some hours ago, but now it is splendid weather. I feel myself quite qualified for guide, I assure you. I can show you all the beauties of the neighbourhood, and throw in a bog and a nest of vipers to boot." Mr Donne languidly assented to this proposal of going out, and then he became restless until Mr Hickson had eaten a hasty lunch, for he hoped to meet Ruth on the way from church, to be near her, and watch her, though he might not be able to speak to her. To have the slow hours roll away, to know he must leave the next day, and yet so close to her, not to be seeing her, was more than he could bear. In an impetuous kind of way, he disregarded all Mr Hickson's offers of guidance to lovely views, and turned a deaf ear to Mr Bradshaw's expressed wish of showing him the land belonging to the house (very little for £14,000), and set off wilfully on the road leading to the church, from which he averred he had seen a view which nothing else about the place could equal. They met the country people dropping homewards. No Ruth was there. She and her pupils had returned by the field way, as Mr Bradshaw informed his guests at dinner time. Mr Donne was very captious all through dinner. He thought it never would be over, and cursed Hickson's interminable stories, which were told on purpose to amuse him. His heart gave a fierce bound when he saw her in the drawing-room with the little girls. She was reading to them, with how sick and trembling a heart no words can tell. But she could master and keep down outward signs of her emotion. An hour more to-night, part of which was to be spent in family prayer, and all in the safety of company. Another hour in the morning, when all would be engaged in the bustle of departure. If, during this short space of time, she could not avoid speaking to him, she could at least keep him at such a distance as to make him feel that henceforward her world and his belonged to separate systems, wide as the heavens apart. By degrees she felt that he was drawing near to where she stood. He was by the table examining the books that lay upon it. Mary and Elizabeth drew off a little space, awe-stricken by the future member for Eccleston. As he bent his head over a book, he said, "I implore you, 5 minutes alone." The little girls could not hear, but Ruth, hemmed in so that no escape was possible, did hear. She took sudden courage, and said in a clear voice, "Will you read the whole passage aloud? I do not remember it." Mr. Hickson, hovering at no great distance, heard these words, and drew near to second Mrs. Denbigh's request. Mr. Bradshaw, who was very sleepy after his unusually late dinner, and longing for bedtime, joined in the request, for it would save the necessity for making talk, and he might, perhaps, get in a nap, undisturbed and unnoticed, before the servants came in to prayers. Mr. Donne was caught. He was obliged to read aloud, although he did not know what he was reading. In the middle of some sentence the door opened, a rush of servants came in, and Mr. Bradshaw became particularly wide awake in an instant, and read them a long sermon with great emphasis and unction, winding up with a prayer almost as long. Ruth sat with her head drooping, more from exhaustion after a season of effort than because she shunned Mr. Donne's looks. He had so lost his power over her, his power which had stirred her so deeply the night before, that, except as one knowing her error and her shame, and making a cruel use of such knowledge, she had quite separated him from the idol of her youth; and yet, for the sake of that first and only love, she would gladly have known what explanation he could offer to account for leaving her. It would have been something gained to her own self-respect if she had learnt that he was not then, as she felt him to be now, cold and egotistical, caring for no one and nothing but what related to himself. Home and Leonard, how strangely peaceful the two seemed! Oh, for the rest that a dream about Leonard would bring! Mary and Elizabeth went to bed immediately after prayers, and Ruth accompanied them. It was planned that the gentlemen should leave early the next morning. They were to breakfast half an hour sooner, to catch the railway train, and this by Mr. Donne's own arrangement, who had been as eager about his canvassing the week before as it was possible for him to be, but who now wished Eccleston and the dissenting interest therein very fervently at the devil. Just as the carriage came round, Mr. Bradshaw turned to Ruth. "Any message for Leonard beyond love, which is a matter of course?" Ruth gasped, for she saw Mr. Donne catch at the name. She did not guess the sudden sharp jealousy called out by the idea that Leonard was a grown-up man. "Who is Leonard?" said he to the little girl standing by him. He did not know which she was. "Mrs. Denbigh's little boy," answered Mary. Under some pretence or other, he drew near to Ruth, and in that low voice which she had learnt to loathe, he said, "Our child?" By the white misery that turned her face to stone, by the wild terror in her imploring eyes, by the gasping breath which came out as the carriage drove away, he knew that he had seized the spell to make her listen at last. End of chapter 23.